Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Hey, Crime Redefined fans. I'm Dion Mitchell, and with me is my co-host, Mehul Anjaria. On this episode of Crime Redefined, we are joined by Lindsey Wade, who retired from the Tacoma Police Department as a cold case detective in 2018 after an illustrious 21-year career. Pretty cool, huh, Mehul?
Yeah, but, she didn't really retire.
That's true.
As soon as she was done with Tacoma Police Department, she immediately started writing a book. And she also began working with the Washington State Attorney General's office. And she was working on their sexual assault kit initiative. And that's because it's pretty clear that her passion is using DNA to solve cold cases. And as a matter of fact, she was instrumental in the 2019 passage of the so-called Jennifer and Michelle's Law, which served to expand the types of samples that could be placed into the DNA database, aka CODIS.
That's right. And I guess I'm always impressed when I hear 21 years at anything.
Yeah, it's true.
It sounds like part of her retirement is she has a new book that's going to be available soon. And it will be a glimpse into the mind of a brilliant detective and her persistence in solving the most difficult and hideous crimes. Her signature case, if you will, is the disturbing sexual assault and murder of Michelle Welch and Jennifer Bastian in 1986 in Tacoma, Washington. They were only 12 and 13 years old, respectively. And at the time, Lindsey Wade was just 11 years old.
This is a disturbing and fascinating case, and it's very cool how it got solved eventually with DNA technology. So we're going to talk about the case with Lindsey, of course, but we're not going to necessarily go through the nuts and bolts of it. So I would recommend listeners that after this episode, check out the Dateline episode entitled Evil Was Watching. And it's all about this case. I think it was from 2019. Lindsey's in it. And so you could actually go to Lindsey's website, which is lindseywade.org, LINDSEYWADE. That's lindseywade.org. And she has a link to the full episode. And also on her site, you can see her appearance on the Case with Paula Zahn. And she's been on a number of news stories as well.
Her work was really familiar to me, not necessarily her work, but the case that she was involved in. Having lived in the Northwest for a number of years myself, I'm particularly interested in hearing about Lindsey's thoughts on Ted Bundy and how she tracked down his DNA. I'm sure that's going to be fascinating. As you will hear, Lindsey has been at the forefront of DNA technology using many of the techniques we have discussed on past Crime Redefined episodes.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be, this interview will be a good rehash of some of the themes we've hit on in the past. But
it's like real world application type stuff.
Right.
Hey, here's a 21 years career. Here's a person who's on the forefront. The things that we're talking about, boom, here they are using. This
is how it's used in the field. And, along those lines, we haven't really talked to many detectives on this podcast. So it's going to be, really cool to hear Lindsey's take on how the system works, how it doesn't work, and how she does her job and what her part in this whole system is. So I really think that, whether listeners, you're a criminal justice practitioner, or maybe you're just a fan of true crime and want to know how things are really done, how investigations are conducted, how DNA and other science is used. I mean, I think you're really going to enjoy this interview and learn a lot from it. So let's get to it.
Hey, Lindsey, welcome to Crime Redefined today.
Thanks for having me.
Mehul and I are excited to speak with you and hear about your interesting cases and amazing career.
Yes. Well, it's been interesting to say the least, but absolutely.
Well, Lindsey, let's kind of go way back. Take us back to 1986. When you first heard about the murders of Michelle Welch and Jennifer Bastian. What kind of effect did that have on you personally when you were a young girl? And, what kind of effect did that have on the community, these terrible murders?
Well, I was a young girl, elementary school. I think I was 11 at the time. And so, it was pretty shocking, and it was pretty terrifying for kids and adults. It really had a pretty significant impact on the community, not just, the city of Tacoma, but kind of the surrounding communities as well. And it lasted a very long time. The cases went unsolved for over 30 years. So they really, became almost like urban legend in this area. And, most people that have lived here for any length of time, knew something about the cases or, had heard about them. And, everybody kind of had their own take on, what kind of an effect the cases had on them personally.
Tell us about what were the big factors in those two cases that led everyone to believe that they must have been committed by the same perpetrator? So I'm curious to know what the factors were in those two cases that led everybody to believe that they must have been committed by the same perpetrator.
So unfortunately, I can't talk about the Michelle Welch case at this point. I've agreed with the prosecutors that I won't do any interviews on that case until it's resolved. That offender is awaiting trial. I'm sure you guys can piece together the information that's already out there in the media about, why we thought the cases were related. But I can't speak about her case at this point.
No problem.
Yeah, fair enough. And we'll come back to that case a little bit, in general terms. But I want to pick up, Lindsey, on your trajectory towards a career in law enforcement. Tell us a little bit about where you were in life when you first picked up The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. And, what drew you to that book? What did you take from that? And, what did that book mean to you?
Well, I was in high school, and, when I read that book, it definitely kind of set me on my path towards becoming a police officer and eventually a detective. That book really scared the shit out of me, to be quite honest. It was just unbelievable. And the fact that a lot of it happened near where I lived, and, that Ted Bundy was from Tacoma, and, just all these things were just so fascinating to me. And, that was the first time that I really read about, police investigations. And I was just absolutely fascinated. And not only was I fascinated with the investigative part, it also just absolutely floored me that, that somebody like him could be so successful and, operate for as long as he did. And, that he just pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. And, people just absolutely could not believe that he would be capable of the crimes that he committed. And so, I just think there were so many different elements about that book that stuck with me. And really, from that point on, I just kind of knew that, that's what I wanted to do with my life was, be a detective.
Yeah, let me build on that a little bit. Tell us about your career in law enforcement, but what were your first impressions of the job while you're at the academy, and then when you first went on patrol?
Oh, okay. So the police academy was, that's your first stop. And so that was at that time a 3-month period. And, really the police academy is like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, you're trying to learn everything. You're trying to learn laws, and you're trying to learn, criminal procedure and how to do traffic stops and how to handcuff somebody. And, there's just so much that, when you get out of the academy. And I mean, I can clearly remember my first day on the street, and, I was 22 years old by that point. And I just remember thinking, this is crazy. Like, I really have no idea what I'm doing. And I mean, honestly, nobody does when they come out of the academy, and that's why you have a training officer, and, you ride with a training officer for several months before you're on your own. And, even then, I think for most officers, it takes several years before you really, feel confident in yourself and your abilities, to handle pretty much any situation that gets thrown at you. I mean, when you think about most jobs, you have kind of a set parameters of what your duties are.
Right.
But when you're a police officer, I mean, it's like anything goes. I mean, your day is not dictated by you. You have no control over what happens, and you're expected to be an expert in about 100 different things. And so it's challenging, and it's it's an exciting job. It's a job like no other, I would say. But I did enjoy my time as a patrol officer. I spent about 5 years in patrol, and then made a short transfer to narcotics. I spent about a year there, and I was on the detectives list when I was in narcotics, and so I ended up getting promoted a little after a year of being there to detective.
Did that switch to narcotics, was that something you wanted to do, or it just came organically?
It was something I wanted to do. I knew it was a good stepping stone for becoming a detective.
That was obviously your end game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have a quick follow-up question. You mentioned the academy was your training there was 3 months, correct?
Yes.
Is that something just that you feel, having gone through it, that should be longer? 4 months, 5 months, 6 months?
It is longer now. It's actually 6 months currently.
Oh, right.
But when I went through, it was 3 months.
So I want to go back to Ted Bundy. So once you became a detective, I understand that you were interested in getting Ted Bundy's DNA profile into CODIS. Could you walk us through a little bit about how you went about doing that and what some of the roadblocks were?
Sure. So in 2011, I was working with my then partner, Gene Miller, and he was the cold case detective for our agency at that time. And we had been discussing the Anne Marie Burr case, which is the oldest cold case in Tacoma. It happened in 1961. And, a lot of people have believed over the years that perhaps Anne Marie Burr might be, Ted Bundy's first victim. And so, we knew that, but at the same time, there was really nothing in the case that linked him to the crime. And so kind of during our early discussions about the case, we started talking about suspects, and of course, Bundy's name came up, and I started, kind of wondering, well, if in fact we do have any testable evidence in this case, are we going to have anybody to compare it to? And so that kind of started me on my journey of researching Bundy and, striking out all over the place when I was searching for his DNA. And, it wasn't in Washington. I couldn't find it at the medical examiner's office where he was executed, and finally ended up getting in contact with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab and talking to their CODIS manager. And, he and I just sort of put our heads together because, he had been asked the same question multiple times. And, the answer was always no, we don't have it. And so, we kind of brainstormed and thought about, well, how could we find his DNA? And so I kind of went on my journey in Washington, tracking down leads, which, ultimately led me to Ann Rule. And, she was able to provide me with some letters and envelopes from letters that he had written to her when he was in jail and prison. And so I thought, well, maybe there's a possibility I could get his DNA from the stamps on the letters. And so that was kind of one avenue of investigation. And then David Kaufman, the CODIS manager down in Florida, he kind of went on his own path. And so I guess they have kind of a Bundy museum at the crime lab down there. And so he looked at some items that were in the lab, but, couldn't get a usable profile. And so he continued on with his search, and he actually ended up finding, I think it was 2 blood vials in I believe it was the Columbia County Clerk's office. And these vials had been collected from Bundy in 1978, shortly after he was arrested. And, the blood itself, the liquid blood, was no good. It was, completely putrefied.
Oh, wow.
Luckily, there was dried blood on the lid of the vials. And so he was able to, his lab was able to generate a full profile from that and get it uploaded into Florida's DNA database, which was a great start. But then I was told that's where it was going to stay because Bundy didn't meet the criteria to go into the national database. And I was like, wait a minute.
After all that.
Yeah, it's great that he's going into Florida, but
right.
He's suspected of murders across the country. How can his DNA only reside in Florida's database? That makes no sense. And so there was conversation that took place with the Indus custodian, the FBI, to try to figure out how to rectify the situation. And eventually it was decided that he would go into national in the legal index. And so that's where he sits currently. And so now his profile, can be searched against profiles from, all the other state databases as well.
That's a good segue to my next question. And besides the case that you just mentioned, are there other murders you're convinced Bundy is responsible for? And if so, which ones?
I can't say I'm convinced of any because there are none that it's just like, oh, for sure. There's so much evidence. Overwhelmingly, it's him. None that I know of. I know that there are, certainly cases that people suspect him of, and I have no doubt that he's committed way more murders than we know about. He confessed to 30 right before he was executed, and 11 of those were in Washington, but only 8 of those victims have been identified. So, we know he committed more murders, but, I don't know, if we'll ever link him to those cases. I hope that at some point he is linked by, scientific methods. But at this point, it's hard to say.
Yeah, that was my next question is, what do you think, just personally, what do you think his real number is?
I don't know. I've heard all the, triple digit stuff. And I don't know. It's hard to say. It is strange that he would have, started his killing career in his 20s. It seems, pretty late for somebody like him to have started killing. But I just don't think that we'll ever know. Well, I know we'll never know his true number. But I think it's, far more than 30.
Well, Lindsey, in researching your career, I learned about, I think for the first time, the phenomenon of these so-called civil commitment centers, such as the one on McNeil Island in Puget Sound. And I actually had never heard of this concept before. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about the history of these centers, what their purpose is, and then, moving into what your specific interest was with regards to them and collecting DNA?
Sure. So there are 22 states in the United States that have civil commitment laws. And what that means is an offender who is deemed to be a sexually violent predator can be detained civilly for an indeterminate amount of time after they serve their prison sentence. So basically, the state deems them too dangerous to be released out into the community when they're done with prison. And so instead of being released, they get detained. And then they go through a trial. And then, if they are found to meet the definition of being a sexually violent predator, then they are detained at this facility. And so in Washington, we have a place called the Special Commitment Center, and it's on McNeil Island. And offenders who are found to be sexually violent predators and those who are pending trial. So those that are just detained waiting to be tried for this, can be held out there, and it's a secured facility. They can't leave. So, since the program started, I believe they've had well over 400 sexually violent predators that have gone through the island. The program started in 1990, I believe, here in Washington. And back again, 2011, it was my year, I guess. 2011, I was working on a cold case, and I was in contact with Department of Corrections on a pretty regular basis because, I would get records from them on different things. And I started asking some questions about the Special Commitment Center, and specifically about, whether or not all the sex predators on the island had their DNA in CODIS. And I never really, got an answer initially. And once they did some research, they figured out that actually, no, the answer is no. A lot of the offenders out there had never had their DNA collected. So it ended up being over 40 people out there who had not had their DNA collected. And so that was a well over a year, probably closer to 2-year long project, working with the Special Commitment Center staff and the State Patrol Crime Lab to get those individuals' DNA collected. And then, there was one person who refused, and so we had to take them to court. And so it took a while, but eventually all the samples were collected from these guys, and some of them had been out there since the 90s, and probably would never be released, because of their history. And so once all the samples were collected and uploaded into CODIS, they ended up actually getting a hit on one of the guys. And his name was Michael Hallgren. And he was, I think he had been out at the Special Commitment Center since 2001. And he had come there from prison, and he hit to a 1980 murder case, and of a 19-year-old woman in Bellevue, Washington, which is a city north of Tacoma. And so that was really exciting, because I really thought, oh gosh, that there's going to be some CODIS hits out of this for sure. These guys are the worst of the worst in Washington. And, sure enough, one of them hit to this murder case. And when I spoke to the detective who was investigating that case, he had been investigating that case for 12 years, had collected, dozens of DNA samples from suspects, and, never made any headway on the case. And then one day he comes into work and he's got this crime lab report in his box that says there's a hit on this cold case, and he had no idea why the hit came in. And so when I called him up and told him about the project, he was pretty excited.
I can't imagine what that feeling must be like as if you're working a cold case, and all of a sudden you're, like you said, you've been, putting in the time and energy in, and then he walks in and then boom, it's laying on his desk.
Yeah. Yeah. And a name that he had never heard before. I mean, he was not in the case file. He wasn't, a person of interest. And so, it was a shock. But, it was just amazing. And he was kind enough to let me go with him to make the arrest out on the island and bring the guy back to be booked in for the murder.
I guess however it gets done, right? No matter how you get there, as long as you get there, right?
Yes, exactly.
Going back to the Michelle Welch and the Jennifer Bastian cases, and it seems like you were really on the forefront of a lot of this DNA technology. There was such an interesting use of everything new in DNA techniques, such as early genetic genealogy, DNA phenotyping, and of course, more advanced genetic genealogy. When you were a detective, how is it that you became aware of these tools and that you stayed on top of all of them, especially since they were kind of growing really by the day?
Right. I made it a point to really try to stay on top of anything, any kind of forensic technology. I've always been really interested in DNA, And so I've just kind of made it my mission to build relationships with people that are much smarter than me. And so,
I do that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like just sort of have created this network of people that I really was able to learn from over the years and ask a ton of questions, whether it was, somebody from the crime lab or, forensic anthropologist, or, I've got a good friend who's a DNA expert. And so it's been helpful to cultivate those relationships and then, stay on top of it by going to trainings and talking with detectives. And really, that's how I first learned about genetic genealogy, was talking to a detective in Phoenix who, told me about the Canal murders and the surname search that Colleen Fitzpatrick had done. And that was in 2015. And, when I heard that, I was like, oh, I got to do this. And so, ultimately that's what led to the arrest in the Jennifer Bastian case, of course, was that surname. And, that was, one of the surnames that Colleen had provided me was Washburn, and that turned out to be, my suspect's last name. So, just it's amazing how fast, just from 2015 to to now to 2021, how quickly the technology has changed, and the advances, between, I thought MVAC was like, the next coming of Christ. And then, all of a sudden, now there's genetic genealogy, and,
Right.
it's been one thing after the other. And it's just such an exciting time for anyone working cold cases, because I can remember for years, there are so many cases that I worked on for years. And I spent hundreds of hours on these cases. I submitted, dozens and dozens of pieces of evidence to the crime lab, to the point where I'm sure the lab was so tired of me calling, and never made a dent, never advanced the cases forward. And it was so frustrating. And, as a cold case detective, that's the majority of your day. That's the majority of your week and your month and your year. It's like swimming upstream. And so when this new technology came along, at least for those cases where there is DNA, it's been a game changer, as you know. These cases that were previously thought to be unsolvable, now, you can get answers. It doesn't help for those cases where you don't have DNA, and I would say most cold cases do not have DNA. So it's still really hard for those families that are waiting for answers, and they, their case doesn't have, can't be worked with genetic genealogy, or, people think it's kind of like a slot machine or like the magic button, but
Right.
It really isn't. Those cases are few and far between. And so, but, I think that right now, there seems to be such a great interest in the public with cold cases. And so I think that's really great, because I think that's going to help kind of keep that energy going and help kind of keep the momentum. And, a lot of agencies don't have resources, and they don't have people to work their cold cases. And so they just are, they're languishing. They're sitting on a shelf collecting dust. And so I think that because of all the interest that's out there, I think that it will help to
Just driving people to take a look at it again.
Yeah. And to, also hopefully have these agencies put some resources towards it.
Right.
But yeah.
You must really think, for the cases where there is DNA, you must look back and go, my God, what were we doing before these technologies were here? You were literally feeling around in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question. Did this make you, because of you were really staying on top of this within the department, did this kind of make you use kind of a baseball term, like a closer, or like a rock star? Everybody that had a DNA in their case, were they all coming to you for your help and for your input?
Not really. No. Yeah, I wouldn't say that. People would ask me questions, but No, I don't think so. It wasn't that way. Although now working at the Attorney General's office, of course, now I have access to cases statewide. And so, I have done some case reviews for other agencies and, looked at their cold cases. And so, I am able to kind of utilize those skills and to help people, other than just Tacoma cases, but cases all around the state of Washington, which has been nice.
Well, Lindsey, other than the almighty gold standard that DNA is, what would you say is the next most powerful tool that you would have as a cold case detective?
Time. Yeah. I mean, you have time and, relationships change. And, that person that might not have wanted to talk 20 years ago because of a relationship they had, that relationship may no longer be in existence. So, or, their life has changed. And so they just feel differently about the situation. So I think time is a benefit and it's something that can help with cold cases. And the fact that you have time as a detective, when you're working a fresh murder case, you're on the clock. The clock is ticking. There's a lot of pressure to solve the case quickly. But with a cold case, you don't have that pressure. You have time to sit back and focus and come up with a game plan and look at the case from different angles. And that's not a luxury that you have with a fresh case.
Yeah, and then I suppose another emerging tool is actually the media and podcasts, just kind of waking people up to getting interested in it. And maybe people are crawling out of the woodwork. And we hear how that is now invigorating a lot of these investigations. It's almost like a crowdsourcing approach to it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I mean, people are interested and, they're talking about these cases and they're, you've got the web sleuth community and, people doing their own research and, it's a lot more visible than it used to be.
Yeah, you've just got a lot of eyeballs, looking at these cases now.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the time period around your retirement from Tacoma PD. What was the status of the Bastian Welch investigation? And then kind of walk us through the case breakthrough that happened shortly after your retirement.
To the extent that you can.
Yep.
Yeah. So I, the beginning of 2018, I had been approached by the Attorney General's office about a grant that they had received and this position that was going to be coming available as an investigator working on the statewide sexual assault kit initiative. And, at that point, I gave it a lot of thought and, I decided that I was ready to make a change and do something different and, to retire from law enforcement. And, by that point, I'd been on for 21 years. And so I decided that I was going to go ahead and do it. And I had been, in the couple years prior to that, doing a ton of work on those cases. And it collected about 160 DNA samples from, potential suspects. And those those samples were being sent off to the lab in small batches for testing. And so January of 2018, I had sent off the last batch of samples to the crime lab, knowing full well, it'd be a few months before the results came back. But I had no hope at that point that, any of them were going to result in a hit. All of the ones in my mind that I thought looked really good had already come back not a match. And so, when I left, I had kind of this to-do list of, all these different things that were pending at the lab that I had handed off to my coworker that took over for me. And it just, I was sad in a sense to be leaving. And really that, one of the hardest things was telling Jennifer Bastian's mom that I was leaving because we had become really close. And, she knew that I had put a lot of time into working on her daughter's case. So that was one of the hardest things. But, I kind of in the back of my mind was thinking, well, I'm going to be doing all this work with DNA for the Attorney General's office. And so, I think there's still hope that at some point, these cases will still be solved. Maybe it'll be as a result of, the sexual assault kit testing. Who knows? So that was sort of, that was it for me. I mean, I left, retired in April of 2018 and went to work for the Attorney General's office. And it was less than a month later, I think it was like 25 days later, I get a call from the detective who replaced me in the cold case unit telling me that he had gotten a hit on the Jennifer Bastian case. And it was, one of the guys that was in that last batch of samples that I had submitted in January. And so, it was overwhelming. It was.
Can I ask where you were at when you got the call? What were you doing? Do you mind if I ask where you were at or what you were doing when you got the call?
Yeah, I was at home. I was working from home. And, when he called me, I couldn't even respond initially. I was just so overwhelmed. And then, I asked him what's the name, who is it? And he told me. And then, I knew exactly who it was when he told me the name Washburn. But, Washburn, he didn't look like a really good suspect on paper. The only reason that I had even included him in my list of people to get samples from was because of his last name. But, everybody else that I had collected from at that point were people that I had kind of deemed higher priority based on, their criminal history, mainly. And this guy, he really didn't have anything that stood out at all. And he really was only, collected from because of his last name. So anyway, it was just overwhelming. And even more difficult was that I had to wait 2 days to tell Patty Bastian about the hit because, of course, we wanted to keep it under wraps until he was in custody. And he was out of state. And so detectives had to fly to Illinois to arrest him. And then as soon as he was in custody, then I got to go knock on Patty's door and tell her the news. And so that was it was the best day of my career, without a doubt, hands down.
And I guess along those lines, Lindsey, you probably never can truly retire because this is going to continue to happen. The cases that you worked on 20, 30 years ago, whatever, they're going to continue to get solved and suck you right back in. And I'm sure along those lines, you've built other relationships with family members, and it just would imagine is going to stay a part of you for the rest of your days.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's hard because, the cases, I think more about the cases that I didn't solve than the cases that I did solve. And, those cases haunt me. I mean, they keep me up at night because, as a detective, I mean, you take those cases personally and, you do build a relationship with family members but you also, have just a personal stake in the case. And so it is hard. And, you ask any homicide detective and when they retire, the hardest thing for them to do when they retire is to have any open cases left because it's just, you feel like you just didn't do your job.
Well, kind of continuing with the more personal questions. I read a fantastic blog post on your website entitled I Am Me. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write that and what its meaning is, particularly through the lens of today, with the tough times for race relations and, of course, police community relations?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote that, it was, kind of, I think maybe it was right after George Floyd, but things had just become just so polarizing. And I kind of feel like I'm sort of stuck in the middle, because I am a Black female, but I'm also, a former police officer. My husband's a police officer. And, I understand both sides. And so I sometimes feel like I'm sort of stuck in the middle. And so that's kind of where that poem came from is, I just had all these thoughts and all these feelings. And, for me, the way that I like to express my feelings is to write things. And so, that's where that came from.
I guess that's kind of a good segue. I want to wish you congratulations. I understand that you're a new author.
Yes. So I started writing my book shortly after I retired. And at this point, just working with my agent on, trying to figure out how we're going to get it published. So it's been a very long road.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, I know nothing about, the publishing industry or the literary world. And so it's been a huge learning curve for me. I'm used to writing police reports where it's like who, when, what, where, why and how, and that's it. You don't add your opinion and you don't add your feelings for sure. And so writing a book that somebody wants to read is quite different than, the style of writing that I'm used to. So it's been challenging, but also a lot of fun to be able to actually, get my thoughts and feelings down on paper and to share, some of the interesting cases that I worked on in my career.
That's really interesting. It makes me think. Can you tell me, just share with our listeners just a little bit about the process, because that's a big transition that you just mentioned. So how do you go from reports to basically entertainment? So how did you carve out a space in your house, and how did you make that transition?
So I think when I was writing the book for most of the time, I literally just, had a desk in my living room, and I would write after my family went to bed. So I just had, peace and quiet. Early on, I actually hired a book coach, and that was the best thing I could have done because she really helped kind of shape the way that I was writing and move it from, okay, just, getting all the facts down versus, what did it look like? What did it smell like? What did it feel like? Let's add some color. All the things that it was like beat into me as a police officer, you don't write that stuff. It took a long time to write it, even though I was used to reading books and I knew what I liked to read. It was hard to write it. And so, it took a lot of editing, a lot of back and forth, a lot of track changes with my book coach. But she really did help push me to add more of that flavor and add the life into the story. And then when I found my agent, she also helped me with that considerably. And so, that it's been great working with people that are professional writers. And, I am not a professional writer. I am, I guess I'm a subject matter expert that's writing about my subject matter. And so it's been great to have those people that are experts in their craft help me along the way.
Well, Lindsey, you've also been a very strong and excellent advocate for the expansion of these DNA databases. Can you describe for us a little bit about the work you did in developing, promoting, and eventually executing Jennifer and Michelle's law?
Yeah, so I worked really closely with Washington State Representative Tina Orwell, and she's been a big proponent of sexual assault reform and a lot of the legislation that's occurred in Washington since 2015 related to sexual assaults and, victims of sexual assault and really, helping survivors get justice. And so I was able to work with her and, we went, I think it took 4 years of advocating before we finally got that bill passed into law. And it was hard. Patty Bastian was a huge advocate, and she would come down to Olympia and testify. I would go down and testify. And it was finally, in 2019, we finally had enough backing and support to get that law passed. And, it was fantastic. it's much needed. And I think it's so great to have, a law, especially related to DNA, in the name of those two girls, because, they should never be forgotten. And I think that, DNA is such a powerful tool, and we assume, I think a lot of people assume that because the DNA laws have been around for so long, that the system really works and that people's DNA does actually get collected when they go to prison and it gets put into CODIS, but, that's not always the case. And so, for me, I'm always looking for ways to kind of fix some of the loopholes when it comes to, DNA related laws.
I want to take advantage, Lindsey, of our unique opportunity to speak with you and your background. You're such an accomplished detective, and I'm really excited to kind of ask this question. Walk us through what are the initial steps in a cold case investigation. So a detective picks up a binder on a case and he or she is hoping to rekindle. What are those first steps out of the gate to kind of fire things up?
Read the case. The first thing you want to do is, I guess even before you read it, is you want to look to make sure you have everything. And, with cold cases, especially, you'll find that there might be documents at the prosecutor's office or the crime lab or the medical examiner's office or the property room that are not in the binder. So it's really important to make sure you have everything to start with, and then to read it over and, usually more than once. And I'm a big sticky note proponent. And so, for me, I would read through the book first, and then go back a second time and read it and make sticky notes and, make notes for myself on things that I found interesting, things I wanted to go back to, things I wanted to look into. And then, you kind of have to figure out, where's everybody at? You've got all these people listed in the case. Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they in prison? Did they move to Oklahoma? You got to figure out where these people are and, are you going to be able to locate them? And then, really, really importantly for me, especially since I always kind of focused on the forensic side, was what about the evidence? What kind of evidence was collected? Is it still maintained? And what can we do with that evidence today that couldn't have been done when the crime was committed? And so, one of the things that I always find interesting is sometimes I'll hear a detective say, well, yeah, they did DNA testing already and they didn't find anything. Okay, well, if they didn't do DNA testing within the last 5 years, they need to do it. Right. So I when people tell me that, I just yeah, okay, let's take another look. But it's not just DNA. I mean, heck, with next generation fingerprinting, they're solving all kinds of cases now with that technology, because a lot of these fingerprints haven't been looked at in these cases for decades. And so, that's really been a game changer for some of these cold cases. But I think it's, just important to look at everything, and because with cold cases, you weren't there, you weren't part of the investigation originally, it's important to go back to the crime scene. It's important to talk to everybody. And, in some cases, I'll even go back and talk to the medical examiner and have them really explain to me, how did you come up with this, or how did the medical examiner from that time come up with this determination, because I don't really understand it. I think the biggest mistake that a detective can make is not asking questions. And I think sometimes people hesitate to ask questions because they feel like it, might undermine them somehow, or, make it seem like they don't know what they're doing. But I think it's the complete opposite. You gotta ask questions and keep asking questions because that's how you learn.
Well, interestingly, in some of the missing persons cases, it seems like, at least on rare occasion, the individual is actually missing on purpose. And I think there's a term like runner or ghosting or something like that. When you have that type of situation, what are some of the telltale signs that someone who is labeled as a missing person actually intended to fall off the grid and disappear?
Gosh, I mean, I had a few cases where, someone intentionally took off and actually committed suicide, but they just were, kind of identified as a missing person for a long period of time until they were found. I can't say that I've had any experience with somebody that just decided like, I'm going to start a new life and go move to, some other place and change my identity. So I haven't dealt with that myself, but I mean, it certainly happens.
So it truly is a rare phenomenon then.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I worked missing persons for quite a few years, and I mean, I can't say that I ever came across that. There were definitely people that got reported missing who, I mean, they weren't intending to like hide from people, but they just, they lived a lifestyle that didn't really lend
needed a break from themselves a little bit and from their situation.
Yeah, like they just, sometimes people don't keep in contact with their relatives or their loved ones because of their lifestyle, especially if they're living a high risk lifestyle, or if they're in a relationship that doesn't allow for that. So there certainly are times when people get reported missing, but they're fine, once they're located, but they just intentionally weren't keeping in contact.
But you think it's a kind of a rare, like if someone, ghosting themselves, you think it's actually pretty rare.
I have not seen that personally.
Wow. So I guess we'll start to wrap it up a little bit. It's only fair that we ask you to tell us about your podcast and to talk about your cold case podcast.
Yeah. So we haven't recorded a new episode in quite a while, but I started the podcast with a friend of mine named Mike McCann, who is also working on a book about Ted Bundy. And so we decided to kind of focus on cold cases, both solved and unsolved, and to, try to focus on, interviewing some of the experts within the field. So, we interviewed Colleen Fitzpatrick in one episode, and we interviewed our state forensic anthropologist. And, we just thought the listeners, aside from just, telling stories about cases, would be interested to hear from, some of the really phenomenal people that do the work, oftentimes behind the scenes on some of these cases.
We enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening to it. Where can people find it at? Where can our listeners find it at?
So the podcast is called Anatomy of a Cold Case, and it's on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, and I don't know, wherever you find your podcasts. I think it's on all of them.
Great. That's enough. I think you hit the big ones.
Well, Lindsey, we learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yes. Well, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, you bet. And, best of luck to you with the book and, whatever else it is you decide to conquer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsey.
Okay.
Well, Dion, I get the feeling that now that Ted Bundy's DNA is in the database, that eventually he's going to be linked, with DNA to many more cases. And obviously the evidence is quite old in those cases from the 70s. But people aren't going to lose interest in him. And if some of that evidence still exists, now that the DNA testing methods are improving, there's going to be a greater and greater chance that they can get usable DNA. And there's just bound to be more hits. And, I wanted to touch on something. I want to get technical here just for a minute. But Lindsey was talking about how it was very hard to get a sample of Ted Bundy's DNA. And eventually they found this vial of blood in the court clerk's office. Well, guess what? If it's at the court clerk's office, it's not refrigerated, obviously. So as she said, the DNA the liquid blood was no good. It was all putrefied, but there was dried blood still somewhere on that vial. And that gave a full profile. So dried blood stains, even if they're stored at room temperature or even worse, they're going to give you DNA for years and years and years. And this is precisely why this is the preferred method of storing DNA from blood is, you put it onto a card, you make a dried stain, and you freeze it.
Right.
So, Dion, did you get your Ted Bundy questions answered?
Yes, no, and maybe.
Okay.
I tried it a couple of times to get her to bite on a couple of questions, but she, being a smart detective, wouldn't bite on those.
She's still a detective after all.
She is. One quick comment is that I found it. Her comment was interesting about I hate to call it a shrine, but the Florida was it Dade County?
The Ted Bundy Museum.
Yeah, the museum.
Yeah,
they actually had like a sign or a shrine or a museum set up for him because there was so much material, which goes to actually my comment. One of the questions I couldn't get her to bite on is, what's his real number? I mean, I was having, I don't think it's 30 or whatever she mentioned it was. I think it's a lot more. I was having deja vu visions of H.H. Holmes that I think that there's no incentive for Ted Bundy to give any kind of a real number, but I would guess it's at least well over 50. You can't be doing what he was doing for that long across the United States in that time period without DNA and these other forensic techniques and have the number, be, in my opinion, unfortunately, that low. I think it's a lot more. I think
and
it will be linked to him. Years.
Yeah. And as a serial killer, you're constantly trying to deceive the cops. So when you get caught, I don't think that ends. You're still going to toy with them. Oh, was it 30 people? Was it 100?
Well, look, we're still, it makes his legacy live on. We're still talking about him, right?
You know what? Dummies like us are still talking about him.
That's right. They're still making movies about him. I mean, come on. Who had the last laugh?
Yeah, right. Exactly. But, she was very dogged with DNA in all her cases, historical ones, Ted Bundy, and current ones. And it was really great to see a detective who was so up to date on the latest DNA trends. And she gave the example when she, when she cracks open a cold case, first thing to do is go talk to the people who worked it originally. Go talk to the medical examiner.
I love that breakdown. That was inside baseball for me.
Yeah, it was.
I think the question was, hey, how do you, what do you do to get started on this? And, some of that stuff is logical. Hey, you do this, but it was really cool to hear it right from a veteran detective.
You know what struck me is that it's essentially the same operation when you're looking at a case post-conviction, because you're looking at it with the eyes that they did not convict the right person. So it's now a cold case again. So if you're trying to exonerate somebody, it's obviously best to solve the case at the same time. So all these steps she was talking about sounded very familiar to me looking at cases from a post-conviction posture. So it's kind of funny how the two worlds in that regard intersect. But
you got the same goal in mind. You may be on different teams, right?
Right.
But the goal is the same. Get the right guy or girl.
It's an unsolved case, any way you look at it.
Right.
So it was what struck me is she was talking about, she went and talked to the detective in this one particular case. He said, oh, yeah, we tried DNA and, it was a dead end. And she asked, well, how long ago? 5 years. Well, my gosh, that's ancient history now in DNA technology. So there's the Lindseys out there. But I think the detective that she described, just saying, hey, we did DNA and that's enough. That's probably more reflective of where most law enforcement is actually at.
I checked that box, right? I checked the DNA box. There's nothing to see here. Let's move along on to something else. Something that maybe they, unfortunately, and I don't mean this as a dig, that they understand. Right?
Well, yeah, for sure. And of course, when DNA was brand new, it was just over everybody's head. And you can't really say that DNA is a new technology, but the way that it's used is constantly new. Every 2 years or something, we have these dramatic breakthroughs. So I don't know how many Lindseys there are out there.
Well, let's also break that down even further. So let's say there's a new DNA technique doesn't come up for a number of years, but let's just stay with genetic genealogy.
Yeah.
There's going to be more people uploading it. So even for that alone, you need to keep going back and tasting it because you may get a familia hit, right? Or a CODIS hit, because every year that database is expanding.
Well, it's true. And I'll kind of run a parallel with attorneys. A lot of attorneys, they might've went 10, 15, 20 years without ever seeing DNA in a case. Part of that is because when DNA was first used, it was clunky and expensive. It was only used in the most serious cases. Well, now, I mean, if it's somebody was jaywalking and dropped a piece of gum, they might use DNA in it. So
Right.
more attorneys, more detectives are going to have to deal with this. It's going to be right in their face.
Right. Yeah, I think it's truly incredible how the technologies like genetic genealogy are closing these cases one after another.
Right. So, I mean, there's no doubt that genetic genealogy is, like you say in the baseball parlance, that it's the closer. But I think one thing we've got to remember is that although, it looks like genetic genealogy quickly solves a case and maybe easily solves a case, you've got to kind of understand how that sausage is actually made. So getting the DNA sample in a lot of cases might be the easy part. And then just uploading it into this open access genealogy, that database, that's probably the easy part. It's what happens after that to actually get the lead that could be extremely labor intensive. And that's why you can't throw this at every case, even if you have a DNA sample, because it's going to take months of hard work and probably numerous individuals working together to refine this genealogy research. In other words, to look at documents, track down leads, interview people, maybe perform additional DNA testing. So to get to that magic moment of cuffing the perp and saying, DNA did it, that takes a lot of time and effort. And, like Lindsey said, most of the cold cases don't even have DNA evidence. So we hear about the genetic genealogy, but it's really just a drop in the bucket of the cold cases there, and it's not available for most of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is going to be a little bit of a timestamp cutoff. So everything after this date, DNA will have an impact because they just weren't collecting it or knew to collect it before this date, right? Unless they, something falls out of the sky and they're able to link it to somebody that could be a potential suspect or witness in a case, correct?
I mean, if you don't have it, you can't test it. And
that's right.
That's just all there is to it. And a lot of times it was collected maybe in the 80s, but it could have been destroyed. It could have been damaged. Believe it or not, these things get lost. For example, like the Ted Bundy blood vial in the clerk's office, it seemed like Lindsey and other people had to go through a lot of work to even locate it. Where was the evidence tracking system in the 70s and the 80s? It was probably written on a cocktail napkin.
Yeah, that was a little bit of a jaw drop for me, kind of thinking, okay, all that, you're right. I mean, there just should have been that she had to go through that much work, and here it was sitting in a lab.
Right.
And there was a shrine, it just,
that was one. And then the clerk's office. So like, like I said before, it's like, well, that, I mean, you're not looking to preserve evidence there. It's just that it was probably a court exhibit and you have to hold on to that stuff. So it was just thrown in a box somewhere.
Well, I guess that kind of a positive side to that Lindsey raised, that time is on the cold case detective side.
Yeah.
That there's no, there's not so much pressure, timing pressure, and that they'll get there when they get there. And then also now departments have dedicated cold case units. This way they're not taking it away from resources from current cases, which I thought was also smart. I think you're going to see a lot more of, I guess, compartmentalizing in, I think, medium to large forces just for that, because I think as we keep moving forward with the DNA, they're going to be able to really go back and like we just talked about and start applying some of this DNA that's sitting on a shelf somewhere to these cold cases.
Well, when you think about the amount of material that has to be reviewed on a cold case, you really can't be pulled in 25 different directions doing other cases. So these dedicated cold units are a great idea, because you think about it, a brand new case, there's only so much evidence, so many police reports, only so much has been done. But if you're looking at a cold case, there might be 40 years of people investigating this and researching it, and you have to plow through all of that. So you really have to be focused on it. And it seems to me that, Lindsey is really, really cut out for this job. And I suppose to the outside world, it sounds like she just sort of sailed through her career, was continually promoted and excelled. But I'm sure, Dion, it wasn't that easy. And, maybe we should have asked her more about some of the challenges that she faced. And hopefully we can talk to her again down the road, particularly when her book comes out. And, even just the fact that in this, in the business she's in, I mean, she's a woman and she's biracial at that. So what challenges must that have brought onto her? And I bet we'll hear about that in her book.
Yeah, I hope so. I still go back to how rewarding it must be when a detective finally solves a mystery that's decades old, Like how cool is it that cases Lindsey worked on for years will likely end up being solved in the future, and she'll continue to celebrate them. I think that's why you get into the business and why she works so hard to become a detective.
Well, you know what else? The more complicated these cases are, the longer they're going to live on, because some of the cases that Lindsey thought were solved are going to come back on appeal. Convictions might be overturned. And so you never get away from these cases, particularly the complicated murder cases.
I agree. But there's another thing I took away from, I guess, from her spirit on this, is that obviously she loves bringing closure to the family. You can tell by that part of the discussion. I don't want to, go too much in that because it just spoke for itself.
Right.
But I'm sure that she also is always, spending a lot of time focusing on the cases that she couldn't solve during her career. I bet you that probably really eats her up.
Yeah, that's definitely a tough side effect to this line of work. And just to kind of close out here, I think that this interview was a great lesson on how it's not really the DNA technology that solves the case. It's the detective who put the work in.
It's the Lindseys of the world.
Yeah. To, first of all, find the DNA and then make sure that it can be compared to as many people as possible. If your suspect's not in a database somewhere, there's just not going to be a hit. So, for example, I was really impressed with how Lindsey thought about these civil commitment centers. And had the idea that, hey, we don't know that their DNA profiles are necessarily in a database. So she went, and wasn't easy, but ended up getting those guys tested. And lo and behold, she solved the case that way.
Well, it's that kind of out of the box thinking that I think is going to keep the, I hate to keep using sports analogies, but the ball, moving down the field, it's like, okay, well, we tried this. We've been doing it this way. How much success? What else can we try?
Well said.
So we look forward to talking with Lindsey again in the near future. And of course, reading her book. It seems like there's so many questions we could have asked her, but we only had a short amount of time. To learn more about Lindsey, check out her website at lindseywade.org. And also check her out on Twitter at ELLEDUB7. That's ELLEDUBB7. And we want to say, hey, thanks again for listening and for interacting with us on social media. Keep those questions coming. We love it. We like to play, stump the DNA expert when we get every chance we get. So
good luck.
Nice. We hope everyone is doing better now that the pandemic is subsiding a little bit. And make sure you check out all of our past episodes at crimeredefined.com. Be well, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.